Is Trump trying to sell martial law to the Second Amendment crowd as the economy continues to collapse and looting reaches apocalyptic levels? Let's talk about it. Alright guys, the footage you are seeing is courtesy of the 4K guy. Go check out his channel. He does stock footage, stock photography of all these crises as they unfold. Watching the unraveling of the American empire unfold day by day, Trump has now essentially threatened martial law, although it's debatable as to whether or not you guys are already under that there in many states. The shit is totally hitting the fan. Looting has run rampant. Small businesses have been destroyed after already having been destroyed for having to close down for several months. But you must beware of the Trojan horse that cometh, because when your president says that he is going to bring in the military to enforce domestic policies, you need to be very concerned. One thing that Trump said in his speech, where he basically announced that there's going to be harsher measures implemented, is that he made sure to cater to his base by mentioning that your Second Amendment rights will be protected. Unfortunately, he didn't mention much about the First Amendment rights. This is not the protesters who are doing this stuff. The looting and the protesting are entirely different things altogether. You essentially have three classes of people. You have the looters, you have the rioters, and then you have the protesters, the legitimate protesters. And some of those protesters may cross the line periodically and, start getting in the police face. But you can tell that they're there for a reason. And most of them tend to stay together and stay organized. The looting is just widespread pockets of people, breaking into shops and just running amok in the streets. While there does appear to be swarms of people that descend on these stores, raid them, and just move on to the next, it's largely scattered. So the protesters, however, are being targeted with equal force by the police, and it almost appears that they are being targeted more. I've seen so many videos where the police totally disregard the looters, not only because they're outnumbered. I think it's maybe that they're just trying to hold a line or whatever the case might be. You see, the looters are a hard catch. The protesters are the ones who are there to stand their ground and state their piece and exercise their First Amendment right. That is there for a reason. A lot of them know that they're going to get arrested, and they sacrifice themselves in a way for the cause, if you will. So a lot of these arrests that are taking place, they're not the looters and the people who are vandalizing things. Yeah, some of them are, but a large portion of those arrested are just the peaceful protesters who stood their ground to express their First Amendment right. The protesters are the easy catch that the authorities get to parade across the TV screen and make it look like they're actually doing something. But that's just like shooting fish in a barrel. It's much easier to arrest a protester and say you booked somebody than to actually go and chase down some of these looters. Miss Sincere, who happens to be a prepper and a fellow YouTuber, she has a smaller channel here. She posted some frightening video footage of some people who were protesting civilly. They weren't on the street, they were on the sidewalk. It looked like they were assembling very peacefully. And all of a sudden, they were descended upon by around 10 vehicles, unmarked vehicles, police cruisers, and like Gestapo thugs, they cracked down on these peaceful protesters. Meanwhile, looting is rampant across the cities. This is on the level of arresting somebody because they're not wearing a mask. Meanwhile, the city is burning down in the distance. If there ever is an unjust law that is passed that you don't agree with, you want to have the right to protest that. If you don't have that right, you are essentially under a dictatorship. Free speech is only a right if you can do it in a public forum, and that can't be bracketed by whatever the establishment views as acceptable. That has to be whenever the people decide, democratically decide. Now, obviously, that rubs up against the freedoms of others, and of course, there has to be a balance there. Typically, these protests tend to self-organize in such a way that they can coexist with the world around them, kind of like how the Occupy movement was. It didn't devolve into total chaos and looting and rioting like we see now. A lot of these looters and vandals, they hijack these protests, or they try to blend in, and then when the sun goes down, or under the cover of the protesters, they go and they do their dirty business. But keep in mind at all times that this is a sign of a collapsing economy. This is a sign of a collapsing economy. This does not happen in a healthy economic environment. So this is a very, very dangerous, slippery slope in which you might see the compromising of the Posse Comitatus Act, which was an act put forth in 1878, and the purpose of which was to limit the powers of the federal government in using military personnel to enforce domestic policies. Trump is threatening to evoke the Insurrection Act, which is an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, which basically empowers him to federalize the National Guards of all the states in order to suppress civil disorder, insurrection, or rebellion. There are plenty of videos where you see them rounding up peaceful protesters, people who came there for the purpose of representing their cause as it pertains to the police brutality that took the life of George Floyd. It appears as though the police are primarily targeting these people with the curfews. These are the organized people. These are the people who are actually going to get things done. You see the looters and the vandals and the rioters, they justify the crackdown. Now, the difference between a looter and a rioter is that a rioter is kind of an offshoot of the protesting movement, although they are a very small sect of the protesting movement. They're the ones who are doing the graffiti. They're the ones who are, partaking in smashing the windows of buildings they don't like. They're not necessarily looting those buildings. Of course, the looters come in afterwards. And then, of course, you have the protesters who are there to do what they're wanting to do peacefully. And a lot of these protesters are attempting to police themselves by accosting those who try to throw bricks at windows, but they can only do so much because there's infiltrators, there's provocateurs, there's anarchists, there's all these people who are trying to hijack their movement, providing cause for a total police crackdown and possibly even the execution of this Insurrection Act by Trump. But California, Minnesota, New York, these places were absolute pandemonium, judging by the footage that I've seen. And you really have to get footage from the average person because the media is getting chased out of these places. The media have become the target of a lot of the ire of many of the protesters. And of course, they can't seem to get a break from law enforcement either. Although it does appear that curfew laws don't apply to the media, and that's probably because they're arguably doing their job. If you're working, then you don't have to abide by the curfew. So maybe there's a bit of a loophole there in that they're on the payroll, so they are doing their job. But this shit is going down big time, and you better be very careful because Trump's speech, in my mind, well, it may seem appropriate to some degree to get a more stricter crackdown in a lot of these cities. His proclamation that he is going to override the authority, the state authority, and the city municipal authority, and bring in the U.S. military. I mean, once that happens, I think they've already had one guy shot. But once you start getting exchanges, which there no doubt have been, and they've gone unreported. Once you start getting those kind of exchanges, the situation is going to spiral out of control rapidly, even though it's already spiraled out of control. I mean, people are probably seeing this on their way to work. This is something which is only going to escalate, okay, if they don't enact some sort of way to kickstart the economy. It is going to start to look like Argentina when they had their crisis there. Now, this police presence, the National Guard presence, and possibly the military presence, it's not just going to go away right away. Because remember, this is now going to continue to flare up every time there's more injustice. And because of the economic dire straits everybody's in, these things are just bound to continue. You see, now what has happened is that the people who are poor have realized that, hey, we drastically outnumber the police, and that unless there's armed police on every single street corner, we will be able to ransack a shop. And what I fear may happen down the road is that they may even restrict social media, because I'm quite certain, and this is just speculation, but I am quite certain that they are using social media to coordinate some of these raids, if you want to call them that. So, will there be some restrictions put in place during curfew times? Who knows? It's hard to say. Will there be, some sort of cell phone jamming or, who knows what might come of it? Because most people forget you're carrying around a tracking device in your pocket. And if some form of martial law takes effect, you can bet that they will use every power at their disposal to algorithmically sort out who's who and who is guilty of what. Even if you have committed no crime, like the people who were basically shot at while they were on their balcony by the troop of riot police and the National Guard. So what you are seeing here is footage from a YouTube channel called the 4K Guy. He provides stock footage for individuals like myself and news media agencies. So he has a lot of interesting footage of what's going on the ground. So I'm going to post a link in the description. And yeah, you can see some of these drone shots here of one of the wildest nights of all. I believe this was from last Saturday night. And you can see that the city of Minnesota is burning down. I would encourage people to step back for a second and take a look at what is going on. You had provocateurs. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that there are instigators and provocateurs, whether they be actual provocateurs or certain anarchist groups. You know that they are given free rein so that they can come in afterwards with the big guns and justify the crackdown and the curfews, which robs everybody's freedom, not just the protesters. And indeed, that also infringes on your First Amendment right, which I'm sure is trumped in some legal form by these curfews, which are enacted, which of course prevents you from resisting directly by way of protest whatever political decisions you might not agree with. So what do you have? You have nearly 25% unemployment. Meanwhile, Wall Street bank accounts continue to get bigger as they are indirectly fed, no pun intended, by the Fed, money which is borrowed on the taxpayers' dime. Looters are ravaging and destroying cities across America, and now they get to bring in the military. Well, how convenient is it that around the time that everybody's poor and broke and there's a pandemic and now it looks like there's going to be tensions escalating between China, how convenient is it that the country is now essentially under some form of a police state? I don't want to say the term martial law because a lot of people are too matter-of-fact about that. They're too technical when they think about that. Just because something isn't called martial law doesn't mean it isn't. You can have all the trappings of martial law without calling it that, and you pretty much have that now, where you have new laws being enacted on the fly, which greatly restrict your freedom and your rights to do certain things. So while it might not be pure martial law in practice, in that it doesn't entail the total suspension of the civil law by the government, it's not a military dictatorship yet. You have something that appears to be almost worse in some cases when there's video footage of Humvees and riot police walking down the street, shooting people with rubber bullets who are on their own balconies, which, might I add, within that place, Minnesota, they were legally allowed to be. And not only that, before the police officer shot at these people, he said, "Light 'em up." Now, every morning that you go to work, if you're one of the lucky ones, you'll get to be greeted by several National Guardsmen and police, fully clad and tacked out in their camouflage gear in the city, and you get to pretend like everything is normal until it isn't. Now, as indicated in previous videos, I started to like Trump more throughout the last few months because it became blatantly obvious that the media was really trying to look for any excuse they could find to demonize his administration on every issue. And one of the things I liked about him is that he wasn't afraid to every day come out and talk to the people for literally 2-3 hours on some occasions when he was doing those COVID press conferences. But all of that changed once again when I heard him basically say that he may order the military to come and keep you safe in your home and enforce curfews across the United States. That has to be one of the most terrifying things you could ever hear any leader say. And I don't even live in the country, and that scares me even more because I'm sure him and Justin will certainly agree on a measure like that now that we have all been disarmed. But he made sure that he emphasized in his speech that those of you with the Second Amendment, and he didn't say it in this exact way, are entitled to defend yourself, which you most definitely are, but almost as if to incite some sort of civil disorder between people. So we all know the looting is horrific. The looting is appalling. The looting is the cringiest thing, and I think it is embarrassing for all the people who live in those communities, even the ones who don't partake in it, because of course they're going to be looked at as being complicit in some way, shape, or form. And I was watching a video where people are walking around Santa Monica like it's just another day, and there's basically anarchy in the streets, like just pure anarchy. It was absolutely insane. I'm going to post that video in the description. I beseech all of the lovers of the Second Amendment to join with the First Amendment protesters, the legitimate protesters who are protesting and organizing and not partaking in this violence, because they are largely separate. But these leeches latch on to that movement and they exploit it and they hide behind it. And of course, the cops come in and crack down on the legitimate protesters. Now, you could argue that the case has been stated, but here is one unfortunate prognosis. It sounds like it's not going to be such a clear-cut case when it comes down to it. It sounds like the protesters may not get the verdict that they're hoping to get. And I just base this on the fact that there was that autopsy that came out that showed no evidence of asphyxiation, even though there was an independent autopsy done that did confirm that he had died by asphyxiation, which seems to be sensible. But if they don't get the verdict they deserve, or if there is some sort of clash between the National Guard, who likely doesn't have any real-world experience within these types of domestic scenarios. I mean, nobody has experience in a scenario like this. Maybe some of the more seasoned vets who may have partaken in some of the other protests around the United States throughout the years, but this is on a whole other level. And if there is another incident which goes live, which is on the level of the George Floyd stuff, this is going to flare up immensely. And we didn't hear a lot of gunshots the first time, but if this flares up again, that's exactly what you're going to hear. And people are going to start raiding grocery stores. Once they stop raiding the shoe stores and they start raiding the grocery stores, which they already are, I should add, they're raiding grocery stores, drug stores, corner stores for those basic necessities. But once that becomes the primary target, you will know you are in a full-blown Mad Max, excessive rule of law, dystopian, shit hits the fan situation. So here it is, guys. Get ready for it. And oh yeah, guess what? The markets are probably going to go up tomorrow, because that's how things work in the postmodern economy. Once again, I want to thank the 4K guy for providing this excellent footage of this crisis as it unfolds. He goes out there, he gets the footage of what's happening there on the ground. So if you want to go and subscribe to his channel, or if you are a media agency and you're looking to license some footage, go and check out his YouTube channel. I'll post a link in the description below. Thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed my thought process on this video. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below.